Hello and welcome to a rare Romeo and Juliet video where I'm going to show you how to get top grades using some really simple contextual information about Shakespeare. So we're looking at Shakespeare's marriage. There he is. That's the most reliable portrait that we have of him. And this is the most reliable portrait we have of his wife, Anne Hathaway. And there are three crucial bits of information I want you to absorb. First, that when William Shakespeare got married, he was 18, just a couple of years older than you. And stranger still, his choice of partner, Anne Hathaway, was 26 at the time, when an adult would be expected to live only into their 50s, maybe 60s at most. This is quite an old age for an 18-year-old to marry, and normally, as in Romeo and Juliet, you would expect the husband to be older than the wife. Shakespeare himself went completely against the social norms of his day. And here, the really fascinating bit of information, Susanna was born, his daughter, 6 months after the marriage. In other words, he'd already got Anne pregnant 3 months before he married her. Okay, well, so far so very interesting, Mr. Salles, but what's that got to do with Romeo and Juliet? Well, it gives us a way into the character of Romeo, and crucially for the top grades, you want to be writing about Shakespeare's purpose in creating Romeo, and therefore the details of his marriage are going to give us a potential insight into that purpose. So one interpretation of Romeo that he is simply fortune's fool, so he's the victim of fate. But also fool includes the idea of not just someone who is being taken advantage of by fate, but also suggests that perhaps Romeo contributes to his own downfall. Many viewers of the play at the time, many in the audience, would simply have seen the play as a warning to parents of teenagers. Keep a close eye on your teenagers because they're likely to be very emotional, very risk-taking, and not think of the consequences of the future. Here's a play, Romeo and Juliet, to prove to you the consequences of the future. And another reason that they would have had that view is the story of Romeo and Juliet wasn't written by Shakespeare. It came to England from Italy and was over 100 years old by the time Shakespeare wrote the play. So many parents would already have seen that message in the story, that they needed to control their children's desires. Then we have the possibility that it is a reworking of his own life. Perhaps he didn't like living with his older wife, and he's wondering, what would have happened if I'd had a different life? And through Romeo and Juliet, he decides, actually, no, probably made the right decision. My life could have been much more disastrous if I'd simply married at 18 to a younger woman who, let's face it, would have been a girl, not a woman at all. And then the final possibility, it's a rejection of youthful ignorance in contrast to his own marriage. So he might be looking at his own unconventional marriage to a 26-year-old grown, mature woman as a really sensible move, and that young people instead make unwise decisions based on ignorance, unlike him. Okay, well, let's see what these ideas look like in writing. So we've got the idea of forbidden love in Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare's marriage hints at his experience of forbidden love, which echoes the rebellion of Romeo and Juliet against their parents' wishes. Next, we have to consider that he is clearly sexually active at a time when virginity, for a woman at any rate, is considered a requirement of marriage. How likely is it that Anne Hathaway had remained a virgin until the age of 26? It's not very likely, is it? So we can read Romeo and Juliet as a criticism of the controlling influence of parents, a control that was clearly not placed on him. So Shakespeare himself rejects the control of his parents in choosing to marry Anne Hathaway. And we don't know that for sure, but that is an inference, an interpretation we can choose. The whole idea of arranged marriage might seem ridiculous to him, and you can see he has very clearly chosen his own partner. His marriage is definitely not arranged. in the sense that he's already chosen his lover in advance and got her pregnant. So we can use this, if we wish, to show that Shakespeare is completely against the idea of arranged marriages, and he believes in marriage for love. And therefore, when the tragedy to Romeo and Juliet occurs, it's not because they're immature, it's actually forced by society, which takes upper class children and forces them to marry for politics, power, money and influence. But you might say, no, I don't agree with that interpretation of Romeo and Juliet. I don't think the tragedy shows that Shakespeare is in favour of young love at all. So we can use the same information to argue the opposite. If she did seduce him, how likely is it that the pregnancy was planned? Yes, it is possible that the marriage was arranged in common law before the church wedding. So this was a tradition where they would meet in front of each other's families, agree to be married, and then they could start having sex legally, if you like, before the actual church wedding took place. Well, that could have happened with Shakespeare, we simply don't know. But it's also possible that the families forced him into marriage because of the pregnancy. So he might be attacking arranged marriages that way. We might then infer Shakespeare attacking arranged marriage because he is the victim of it. But there is, of course, another possibility here, which is that Anne Hathaway knew exactly what she was doing. She might have deliberately got pregnant in order to trap Shakespeare into a marriage, in which case we could look at Romeo and Juliet's marriage as a vision of escape into true love, which he himself didn't have. Throughout history, people have kept asking themselves, well, did Shakespeare love his wife or not? And one of the reasons for that is he spent so long away from Stratford. Obviously, his theatres and business were all in London. But he still kept coming back to Stratford and had lots of business interests there, and the second largest house in the town. It was a massive, massive property. So in modern terms, he was a wealthy millionaire who chose to have his main property not in London. He didn't have big houses in London. He rented in London, in Stratford. And so they're thinking, is this proof that he loved Anne Hathaway, or proof that he chose to spend so much time away from her? Is that proof that he didn't love her? And so the only real bit of evidence that people can pick on is what's in his will. And so these are the words of his will. I give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture. Now that's not much for a millionaire to hand over, is it? But he gave all his property to his daughter and her husband. Now, in law, Anne Hathaway would have been allowed to live in the house until her death. That was just expected. So that didn't have to go in the will. So readers are really puzzled. Does this prove he didn't need to give her anything else because actually it was already there? She was already in the house. Or was this an attack on his wife, a snub? We simply don't know, but you can argue it either way. So you can use that evidence to show how much he loved her, or to show that he really despised her. And finally, we could see the detail of Shakespeare's own marriage to an older woman as a criticism of youth. So we might also read in this criticism of Romeo in Shakespeare's marriage. Romeo is possibly around 17 to Juliet's 13. Remember, she's 2 weeks from her 14th birthday. Significantly, he's first attracted to Rosaline, who is older than he is, and too mature to believe that Romeo is in love with her, believing instead that he is only interested in sex, which is why Romeo complains that she won't ope her lap to saint seducing gold. So when we read that description, we can see that Romeo is simply after losing his virginity, or if he's already done that, gaining as much sexual experience as he can, and he's using his influence as a person of power and wealth to try and bribe women, essentially, into having sex with him. So he's buying them gifts of jewellery and gold. And Rosaline's rejected that. She's simply too mature for him. And the tragedy unfolds because Romeo then finds a lover who is much, much less mature and therefore far more impulsive. And he contrasts that with his own marriage. We could actually go even deeper here and talk about society. So society at the time forbids sex before marriage, and as we've seen, Shakespeare completely rejected that view. He had sex with Anne Hathaway several months before marrying her because she was pregnant. And we could argue that this tragedy would not have happened if sex before marriage had been allowed, because then Romeo and Juliet could have had a sexual relationship. Obviously, we're upset about these ages, but in Shakespeare's time they wouldn't have been. And there would have been no secret marriage. There would therefore have been no tragedy of Juliet having to commit suicide rather than, or take the risk of committing suicide. She didn't know if the potion was going to kill her or not. She wouldn't have had to take that risk in order to refuse to marry Paris. That marriage could still have gone ahead. And if we go back a step further, Rosaline could indeed have decided to have a relationship with Romeo. We can infer that the only reason she's refused him is that she has to preserve her own virginity for her marriage. She might well have been in love with Romeo as he thinks he was with her, but she was in no position to risk having sex outside marriage, because then she wouldn't be able to find a suitable husband later. So I hope you can see how these three simple facts help you to explore Shakespeare's possible purpose and viewpoint in the play. And what's so cool about them is that you can argue opposite viewpoints. Therefore, it's going to be relevant to every single one of you, whichever interpretation you think of the play. You'll be able to use these facts to back it up. And that's all you need. A little bit of context chucked in will get you the context marks. But that's not why you do it. You do it because it gives you a richer and deeper understanding of your own interpretation of the play. So, I do hope I'm speaking to some new viewers. Please consider subscribing. If you are an old viewer, please drop me a comment in the comments below and let me know what sort of videos you'd like me to make next. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck with your revision.